Chapter 5. Things which are not woman. The beggars had been too absorbed in their triumph over the albino and their plans for their attack on the caravan of Tanalorn to seek the mounts on which Elric and Moonglum had come to Nadsakor. They found the horses where they had left them the previous night. The superb Shazarian steeds were cropping the grass as if they had been waiting only a few minutes. They climbed into their saddles and soon were riding as fast as the fleet horses could carry them, north-northeast to the point the caravan was logically due to reach. Shortly after noon they had found it, a long sprawl of wagons and horses, awnings of gay rich silks, brightly decorated harness. It stretched across the floor of a shallow valley, and surrounding it on all sides was the squalid and motley beggar armour of King Urish of Nadsakor. Elric and Moonglum reined in their horses when they reached the brow of the hill, and they watched. Theleb Ka'ana and King Urish were not immediately visible, and at last Elric saw them on the opposite hill. By the way in which the sorcerer was stretching out his arms to the deep blue sky, Elric guessed he was already summoning the aid of that he had promised Urish. Below, Elric saw a flash of red, and knew that it must be the scarlet garb of the Red Archer. Peering closer, he saw one or two other shapes he recognised. Brute of Lashmar with his blonde hair, and his huge burly body almost dwarfing his warhorse. Karkan, once of Pantang himself, but now dressed in the checkered cloak and fur cap of the barbarians of southern Ilmiorda. Rakir himself had been a warrior priest from Moonglum's country, beyond the Weeping Waste. But all these men had forsworn their gods to go and live in peaceful Tanalorn, where, it was said, even the greatest lords of the higher worlds could not enter. Eternal Tanalorn, which had stood for uncountable cycles and would outlive the earth herself. Knowing nothing of Theleb Ka'ana's plan, Rakir was plainly not too worried by the appearance of the beggar rabble, which was as poorly armed as those Elric and Moonglum had fought in Nadsakor. "We must ride through their army to reach Rakir now," Moonglum said. Elric nodded, but he made no move. He was watching the distant hill where Theleb Ka'ana continued his incantation, hoping that he might guess what kind of aid the sorcerer was summoning. A moment later, Elric yelled and spurred his horse down the hill at a gallop. Moonglum was almost as startled as the beggars as he followed his friend into the thick of the ragged horde, slashing this way and that with the longest of his swords. Elric's Stormbringer emitted black radiance as it carved a bloody path through the beggar army, leaving in its wake a mess of dismembered bodies, entrails and dead horrified eyes. Moonglum's horse was splashed with blood to the shoulder, and it snorted and balked at following the white-skinned demon through the howling black blade. But Moonglum, afraid that the beggar ranks would close, forced it on until at last they were both riding towards the caravan, and someone was yelling Elric's name. It was Rakir the Red Archer, clothed in scarlet from head to foot, with a red bone bow in his hand and a red quiver of crimson-fletched arrows on his back. On his head was a scarlet skull-cap, decorated with a single scarlet feather. His face was weather-beaten and all but fleshless. He had fought with Elric before the fall of Imrir, and together they had discovered Tanalorn. Rakir had stayed, but Elric had gone back to Malnibone, still obsessed with his need to awaken his cousin Cimmeril, whom her brother Urkun had put into a sorcerous slumber in order to spite Elric, who loved her. Elric had not seen Rakir since then. Now he noted an enviable look of peace in the archer's eyes. Rakir had once been a warrior priest in the Eastlands, serving chaos, but now he served nothing but his tranquil Tanalorn. "Elric, have you come to help us send Urish and his beggars back to where they come from?" Rakir was laughing, evidently pleased to meet his old friend. "And Moonglum, when did you two meet? I have not seen thee since I left the Eastlands." Moonglum grinned. "Much has come to pass since those days, Rakir." Rakir rubbed at his aquiline nose. "Aye, so I've heard." Elric dismounted swiftly. "No time for reminiscence now, Rakir. You're in greater danger than you know." What? When did the beggar rabble of Nadsakor offer anything to fear? Look how poorly armed they are. They have a sorcerer with them, Theleb Ka'ana of Pan Tang. See, that's him on yonder hill. Rakia frowned. Sorcery? These days I've little guard against that. How good is the sorcerer, do you know? He is one of the most powerful in Pantang, and the wizards of Pantang almost equal your folk, Elric, in their skills. I fear he more than equals me at present, for my Actorios ring has been stolen from me by Urish. Rakia looked strangely at Elric, noting something in the albino's face which he had evidently not seen there when they last parted. Well, he said, we shall have to defend ourselves as best we can. If you cut loose your horses so that all your folk could be mounted, we might be able to escape before Theleb Ka'ana invokes whatever supernatural aid it is he seeks. Elric nodded as the giant, Brute of Lashmar, rode up grinning at him. Brute had been a hero in Lashmar before he had disgraced himself. Rakia shook his head. Tanalorn needs the provisions we carry. Look, said Moonglum quietly. On the hill where Theleb Ka'ana had been standing, there had now appeared a billowing cloud of redness, like blood in clear water. He is successful, Rakia murmured. Brute, let all be mounted. We've no time to prepare further defences, but we'll have the advantage of being on horseback when they attack. Brute thundered off, yelling at the men of Tanalorn. They began to unharness the wagon horses and ready their weapons. The cloud of redness above was beginning to disperse, and out of it shapes were emerging. Elric tried to distinguish the shapes, but could not at that distance. He climbed back into his saddle as the horsemen of Tanalorn now formed themselves into groups which would, when the attack came, race through the unmounted beggars, striking swiftly and passing on. Rakia waved to Elric and went to join one of these divisions. Elric and Moonglum found themselves at the head of a dozen warriors armed with axes, pikes and lances. Then Urish's voice cawed out over the waiting silence. Attack, my beggars, they are doomed! The beggar rabble began to move down the sides of the valley. Rakia raised his sword at the signal to the men. Then the first groups of cavalry rode out from the caravan, straight at the advancing beggars. Rakia replaced his blade and took up his bow. From where he sat on his horse he began to send arrow after arrow into the beggar ranks. There was shouting everywhere now as the warriors of Tanalorn met their foes, driving wedges everywhere in their mass. Elric saw Karkan's checkered cape in the midst of the sea of rags, filthy limbs, clubs and knives. He saw Brute's great blonde head towering over a cluster of human filth. And Moonglum said, Such creatures as these are unfit opponents for the warriors of Tanalorn. Elric pointed grimly up the hill. Perhaps they'll prefer their new foes. Moonglum gasped. They are women. Elric drew Stormbringer from its scabbard. They are not women. They are Elanoin. They come from the 8th plane, and neither are they human. You will see. You recognize them? My ancestors fought them once. A strange, shrill ululation reached their ears now. It came from the hillside where Theleb Ka'ana's figure could again be seen. It came from the shapes which Moonglum was sure were women. Red-haired women whose tresses fell almost to their knees, covered their otherwise completely naked bodies. They danced down the hill towards the besieged caravan, and they whirled swords about their heads, which must have been over 5 feet long. Theleb Ka'ana is clever, Elric muttered. The warriors of Tanalorn will hesitate before striking at women, and while they hesitate, the Elanoian will rip and slash and slay them. Rakia had already seen the Elanoian, and he too recognized them for what they were. Do not be deceived, men, he called. These creatures are demons. He glanced across at Elric, and there was a look of resignation on his face. He knew the power of the Elanoian. He spurred his horse towards the albino. What can we do, Elric? Elric sighed. What can mortals do against the Illinoian? Have you no sorcery? With the Ring of Kings I could summon the Graaluk, perhaps. They are the ancient enemies of the Illinoian. Thalab Ka'ana has already made a gateway from the 8th plane. Could you not try to call the Graaluk? Rakia begged. While I tried my sword would not be aiding you. I think Stormbringer is more use today than spells. Rakia shuddered and turned his horse away to order his men to reform their ranks. He knew now they were all going to die. And now the beggars fell back, as horrified by the Illinoian as were the men of Tanalorn. Still singing their shrill, chill song, the Illinoian lowered their swords and spread out along the hill, each one smiling at them. How can they? And then Moonglum saw their eyes. They were huge, orange, animal eyes. Oh, by the gods! And then he saw their teeth, long, pointed teeth which glinted like metal. The horsemen of Tanalorn fell back to the wagons in a long, ragged line. Horror, despair, uncertainty was on every face save Elric's, and on his face was a look of grim anger. His crimson eyes smouldered as he held Stormbringer across his saddle pommel and regarded the demon woman, the Illinoian. The singing grew louder until it made their ears fill with sharp pain and made their stomachs turn. The Illinoian raised their slender arms and began to whirl their long swords about their heads again, staring at them all the while through beast-like, insensate eyes. Malicious, unblinking eyes. Then Karkan of Pantang, his fur cap askew, his checkered cloak billowing, gave a strangled yell and urged his heavy horse at them, his own sword waving. "Back, demons! Back, spawn of hell!" "Ah!" gasped the Illinoian in anticipation. "Yee!" they sang, and Karkan was suddenly in the midst of a dozen slender, slashing swords, and he and his horse were cut all to tiny morsels of flesh, which lay in a heap at the feet of the Illinoian. Their laughter filled the valley as some of them bent to pop the flesh into their fanged mouths. A groan of horror and hatred went up from the ranks of Tanalorn then, and screaming men, hysterical with fear and disgust, began to fling themselves at the Illinoian, who laughed the more and whirled their sharp swords. Stormbringer murmured as it seemed to hear the sounds of battle, but Elric did not move as he stared at the scene. He knew that the Illinoian would kill all as they had killed Karkan. Moonglum moaned. "Elric, there must be some sorcery against them." "There is, but I cannot summon the Graaluk." Elric's chest was heaving and his brain was in turmoil. "I cannot, Moonglum." "Well, for the sake of Tanalorn you must try." Then Elric was riding forward, Stormbringer howling, riding as the Illinoian and screaming Ariok's name as his ancestors had screamed it since the founding of Imrir. "Blood and souls for my lord Ariok!" He parried the whirling blade of an Illinoian and glared into the bestial eyes as Stormbringer sent a shudder down his arm. He struck, and his own blow was parried by the demon that was not a woman. Red hair swung and curled around his throat. He hacked at it, and it loosened its grip. He thrust at the naked body, and the Illinoian danced aside. Another whistling blow from the slim sword, and he flung himself backwards to avoid it, toppling from his saddle and springing instantly to his feet to parry a second attack. Gripping Stormbringer in both hands, stepping forward under the blade to plunge the black sword into the smooth belly. The Illinoian shouted with anger, and green foulness billowed from the wound. The Illinoian fell, still glaring and snarling, still living. Elric chopped at the neck, and the head sprang off, its hair thrashing at him. He dashed forward, picked up the head and began to run up the hill to where the beggars were gathered, watching the destruction of Tanalorn's warriors. As he approached, the beggars broke and began to run, but he caught one on the back with his blade. The man fell, tried to crawl on, but his twisted knees would not support him, and he collapsed into the stained grass. Ulrich picked the wretch up and flung him over his shoulder. Then he turned and began to run down the hill back to the camp. The warriors of Tanalorn were fighting well, but half their number had already been slain by the Illinoian. Almost unbelievably, there were also several Illinoian corpses on the field. Ulrich saw Moonglum defending himself with 2 swords. He saw Rakia still mounted, shouting orders to his men. He saw Brute of Lashmar in the thick of the fight. But he ran on until he stood behind one of the wagons and had dropped both his bloody bundles to the ground. With his sword he split open the twitching body of the beggar and gathered up the hair of the Illinoian and soaked it in the man's blood. Again he stood upright, looking towards the west, with the bloody hair in one hand and Stormbringer in the other. He rose both sword and head, and began to speak in the ancient high speech of Melniboné. Held to the west and soaked in the blood of an enemy, the hair of an Illinoian must be used to summon the enemies of the Illinoian, the Graalok. He remembered the words he had read in his father's ancient grimoire. And now the invocation. Graalok come and Graalok slay. Come kill thine ancient enemy. Make this thy victory day. All the strength of the burning god was leaving him as he used the energy to perform the invocation. And perhaps without the Ring of Kings he was wasting that strength for nothing. Graalok, speed without delay. Come kill thine ancient enemy. Make this thy vengeance day. The spell was far less complex than many he had used in the past, yet it took as much from him as any spell ever had. Graalok, I summon thee. Graalok, here you may take vengeance on your foes. Many cycles since, the Illinoian was said to have driven the Graalok from their lands in the 8th plane, and the Graalok sought revenge now at every opportunity. All around Elric the air shivered and turned brown, then green, then black. Graalok, come destroy the Illinoian. Elric's voice was weakening. Graalok, the gateway is made. And now the ground trembled, and strange winds blew at the blood-soaked hair of the Illinoian, and the air became thick and purple, and Elric fell to his knees, still croaking the invocation. Graalok. A shuffling sound. A grunting noise. A stink of something unnameable. The Graalok had come. They were ape-like creatures, as bestial as the Illinoian. They carried nets and ropes and shields. Once, it was said, both Graalok and Illinoian had had intelligence, had been part of the same species, which had devolved and divided. They moved out of the purple mist in their scores, and they stood looking at Elric, who was still on his knees. Elric pointed at where the remaining warriors of Tanalorn were still fighting the Illinoian. There. The Graalok snorted with battle greed and shambled towards the Illinoian. The Illinoian saw them, and their shrill, wailing voices changed in quality as they retreated a short distance up the hill. Elric forced himself to his feet and gasped, Rakia, withdraw your warriors. The Graalok will do their work now. You helped us after all, Rakia yelled, turning his horse. His clothes were all in tatters, and there were a dozen wounds on his body. They watched as the Graalok's nets and nooses flashed towards the screaming Illinoian, whose sword blows were stopped by the Graalok shields. They watched as the Illinoian were crushed and throttled, and parts of their entrails devoured by the grunting ape-like demons. And when the last of the Illinoian was dead, the Graalok picked up the fallen swords and reversed them, and fell upon them. Rakia said, They are killing themselves. Why? They live only to destroy the Illinoian. Once that is done, they have nothing left for which to exist. Ulrich swayed, and Rakia and Moonglum caught him. See, Moonglum laughed, the beggars are running. Thaleb Kana, Ulrich muttered. We must get Thaleb Kana. Well, doubtless he has gone back with Urish to Nadsakor, Moonglum said. I must retrieve the Ring of Kings. Well, plainly you can work your sorcery without it, Rakia said. Can I? Ulrich looked up and showed his face to Rakia, who lowered his eyes and nodded. We will help you get back your ring, Rakia said quietly. There'll be no more trouble from the beggars. We'll ride with you to Nadsakor. I had hoped you would. Ulrich climbed with difficulty into the saddle of a surviving horse and jerked at its reins, turning it towards the city of beggars. Perhaps your arrows will slay what my sword cannot. I do not understand you, Rakia said. Moonglum was mounting now. We'll tell you on the way.